Okay, I am going to talk about revolutions from 1815 to 1848, and why 1848 was such a pivotal year in Western European history, and why the Congress of Vienna, in the aftermath of Napoleon, failed to turn back the hands of time. So, after Napoleon conquered a whole bunch of places, and Western Europe was torn apart by the seams. And after he was exiled twice and whatever, he was finally out of the picture. The Congress of Vienna was a series of leaders from around Europe. Major players were like Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, um, France also joined together and said, "Hey, let's keep another upstart from happening. How can we do this?" What they attempted to do was maintain a balance of power um, among conservative political leaders that were the traditional monarchs before Napoleon came around and took over the place. So they also wanted to create a concert of Europe, which was basically a state of harmony between these nations that would cooperate with each other, and in case somebody came along and tried to start taking over the place, they would work together to put these forces down and to limit revolutions and to prevent the spread of liberalism. One of the things that they attempted to do was to redistribute territories that Napoleon had conquered to the various um, nations that claimed to have some kind of need for a reward because they helped defeat Napoleon. Among these were, Russia and Prussia and whatever. Anyway, so when they did that, people who lived in these territories didn't necessarily want to be colored in that box. There was a feeling of nationalism building, and nationalism combined with liberalism, and there were a lot of demands for political and social reform. And the Congress of Vienna wanted to just go back to the way it was before Napoleon. They wanted all the traditional monarchs back in power, and they wanted peace. It was quite a nice utopian idea that they actually had. But anyway, the French Revolution of 1789 was still stirring. It was still nostalgic, not only in France but all along the continent of Europe. And these people were facing economic difficulties related to unemployment, hunger. Um, they wanted political reforms like universal male suffrage. I mean, this is coming after the period where, like, after the Enlightenment, after the French Revolution, all these people wanted reform. They wanted basic liberties and rights like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, um, equal rights and representation in the government, in the parliament, and stuff like that. So people really wanted that change, and what the Congress of Vienna wanted to do was to prevent this change and to just get the status quo ante, or the way it was before, to turn back the hands of time and to maintain social order like that. Now, they had a number of things standing in their way. And between 1815 and 1848, the Congress of Vienna first started meeting in 1815. There were a number of revolutions that swept across Europe, and a number of pressures for reform that really kept them from turning back the hands of time. Let's take a look at France, because that's where it started. And I think it was Metternich who was the leader of the Congress of Vienna, an Austrian prime minister, um, the state minister of state. He he said that when France sneezes, everyone catches a cold. All of Europe catches a cold. And that's true in this case, because when the Congress of Vienna restored the Bourbon monarch Louis XVIII to the throne, by the way, he was chased off the throne by Napoleon. So when they tried to restore him, he claimed absolute power, and there were still a lot of problems. Even though in the name of reconciliation he granted a charter to concede some rights like legal equality, careers that were open to talent, a two-chamber parliamentary government, voting rights were still excluded. Voting rights still excluded most citizens from government. And combined with this sting of military defeat and his narrow base of support, and nostalgia for glorious Napoleonic past and memories of the revolution, they were undermining this restoration in France. So in 1824, Louis XVIII was succeeded by his conservative brother, Charles X, who was very unpopular. Charles sought to reverse the legacies of Napoleon and the Revolution. He provoked discontent among French liberals when he restored the Catholic Church to schools and began to organize an oppositional movement. The liberals began to organize an oppositional movement in Parliament. Adding to this discontent was the economic troubles. Police reports documented widespread hunger, unemployment, and anger. So Charles called for new elections, and when the liberals went against him, he tried to overthrow the Parliament with the July Ordinances of 1830. He dissolved this new assembly before it even met, he restricted suffrage even further, and then he announced strict censorship. Following this was the street revolutions in France. The army unwilling to fire into the crowd, Charles eventually abdicated. And in his replacement, the people crowned a constitutional monarch, Louis Philippe. Under Louis Philippe, there was the July monarchy, which doubled the amount of voters, though it was still based on property requirements. It brought the common people back into politics, it revived memories of 1879, and it spurred movements elsewhere in Europe. The political landscape changed for the Congress of Vienna because they wanted things in the name of the old age, and they couldn't handle the changes that were occurring with the new age. Okay, so in 1815, one of the other things that they did was they tried to join present-day Belgium to Holland to serve as a buffer for France. The Belgians never accepted this agreement, and time went by. When the news of the 1830 revolutions in France got to them, Brussels, the city of Brussels, rebelled and forced the Dutch troops to withdraw, and they were unwilling to intervene, and so they accepted a state of neutrality until they remained until 1914. But anyway, you can see the year 1830 to 1832 was a time of turmoil for the concert of Europe. After Belgium and France, the unrest spread to Poland under the Russian Tsar Constantine, who, well, Poland had its own parliament, a relatively broad electorate, constitution, liberties of speech, and the press. And the Russian Tsar ignored these. And with news of the revolution in France in 1830, people revolted, including aristocrats, students, military officers, and middle-class people, and they drove Constantine out. So we got Charles leaving France in 1830, and then around the same time in Poland, Constantine is being driven out. So Congress of Vienna is not very successful with keeping these leaders in the place where they want them to be. Okay, so to understand really further what was going on, let's look at Britain, because Great Britain never actually had a real revolution. There almost was, with the Peterloo Massacre of 1819, but Britain was one of the most liberal nations in Europe around this time. However, after the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was broke, especially in agriculture, and there was considerable social unrest provoked by hunger, poor wages, and unemployment. In the industrial towns of the north, where a lot of people lived, radical members of the middle class joined with workers to demand increased representation in Parliament. They demonstrated en masse at the St. Peter's Field in Manchester, and the militia charged the crowd, killing 11 people and injuring hundreds. Now, radicals condemned Peterloo as domestic Waterloo and criticized the nation's army for turning it on its own citizens. As a result, Parliament promptly passed the Six Acts of 1819, outlawing seditious literature, increasing the Stamp Act on newspapers, allowing house searches, and restricting the rights of assembly. But British political leaders reversed their opposition to reform in response to pressure from below, meaning from the people, rather than from above and from the people in power. And because they made reforms, that's one of the reasons why there was never actually a real revolution in Great Britain during this time. Reforms began under the conservative Tory party, when Catholics and non-Anglican Protestants were allowed to participate in public life, whatever that means. But the Tories refused to reform representation in the House of Commons. 2/3 of the House of Commons owed patronage to wealthy landowners. So there was still this problem between owning land and being allowed in parliamentary rule. There are these places called rotten boroughs that existed, where it was just after the Industrial Revolution, people left land to go urbanize. So in these rotten boroughs, there were wealthy aristocratic landowners who still because there were a lot of them. There were a lot of landowners who used their power to serve the interests of Parliament. And people argue that the interest of land property coincided with the nation at large, and that was just not fair, you know. So you had the liberals and the Whig Party, which were the new industrial middle class, combined with the workers. They wanted reform. So after that came the Reform Bill of 1832, which eliminated the rotten boroughs and reallocated 143 parliamentary seats from the rural south to the industrial north. The bill expanded the franchise, but only still 1 in 6 men could vote. The influence of the landed aristocrats had weakened, but it wasn't destroyed. But the newly joined middle class and workers in Parliament ruled Britain for centuries. Some changes that the more liberal Parliament made were also the abolition of slavery in Great Britain in 1838, and another thing to look at were the Corn Laws, which were implemented in order to protect foreign competition in agriculture, but it actually just placed tariffs on British imports and drove the price of grain up, causing hunger and starving, like people who didn't have money were really complaining. So that sparked the anti-Corn League movement, which eventually the Corn Laws were repealed in 1846. So there's another example of Britain really holding down the fort. But still, there were reformers that pushed for change past the Reform Bill of 1832. There was a petition known as the People's Charter, which demanded 6 things. I think universal white male suffrage, a secret ballot, an end to property qualifications as a condition of public office, annual parliamentary elections, salaries for the House of Commons, and equal electoral districts. The Chartist organization had millions of signatures, and the movement spread in the 1840s through economic hardships. And the common goal was social justice through political democracy, right? Parliament rejected the Chartist efforts twice. Members resorted to strikes, trade union demonstrations, attacks on factories and manufacturers who imposed low wages and long hours. The movement peaked in April of 1848. Inspired by the revolutions in continental Europe, Chartists planned a major demonstration in London. 25,000 workers marched to Parliament with 6 million signatures. The movement ended from just continued resistance to battle and disorder. But similar economic and political problems occurred elsewhere on the continent, sparking revolution. Poor harvests in the 1840s and harvest grain failure in 1846 really caused problems. This is known as the Hungry 40s. But in 1846, a potato blight starved Ireland and also made Germany hungry. Food prices doubled and bread riots broke out across Europe. Starving and unemployed people swamped public relief organizations. And hunger alone doesn't cause revolution, but it tests the government's ability to manage a crisis. In France, after the Revolution of 1830 under Charles, it turned out that King Louis Philippe wasn't so different of a monarch. He still gathered around members of the banking and industrial elite. And when confronted with demands to enlarge the franchise, he equipped he quipped that everyone was free to rise to the wealthy. He said, "Enrich yourselves." He said building projects, and especially the railway, provided opportunities for people to become engaged and wealthy. Protest movements proliferated, and these organizations were banned by Louis Philippe in 1834. Rebellions broke out in Paris and Lyon, resulting in oppression, arrests, and death. The government's refusal to compromise drove even moderates into opposition. So, because assemblies were banned, banquets were formed in an attempt to meet around the laws against assemblies. But in February of 1848, a large banquet meeting was canceled by Louis Philippe, and reactions in the following days caused him to abdicate the throne. So, you got Constantine, you got Charles X, and then Louis Philippe abdicating. So, the government was just not able to, the leaders weren't able to keep up with these radical movements that demanded political and social reform. Following the abdication of Louis Philippe, there was a provisional government and a new republic that was made of liberals, Republicans, and for the first time, socialists. They made a new constitution with new rights, including universal male suffrage. But there were still tensions between socialists and property Republicans, and this shattered the unity of the coalition. Working men and women demanded the right to earn a living wage. So national workshops were developed in response. This program of public works gave jobs to the unemployed. 120,000 people sought jobs in June 1848, way more than the national workshops planned to provide for. But the provisional government lifted restrictions on speech and assembly. The majority of the new assembly deemed that workshops were a threat to order and a financial drain, though, and workshops were abolished in 1848. In response to the workshop abolition came the third major wave of revolution in France in 1848, where people built barricades across Paris. The battle was hopeless, and the forces were oppressed. 3,000 people killed, 12,000 arrested, and prisoners were deported to Algerian labor camps. Parliament hoped for a strong leader to restore order in the aftermath of the workshop revolt. And Napoleon III, nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, was elected with twice as many votes as the other three candidates combined. He restored the Catholic Church to education, and he sent expedition to protect the Pope in Rome. He banned radical activities, workers' associations, and suspended press freedoms. And in 1848, he called for a plebiscite to change the Constitution, and in 1852, he established the Second Empire, announcing himself as Emperor of the French, just like his uncle did. Okay, so dynamics of the French Revolution in 1848 would be repeated elsewhere. This was a very pivotal time, especially because of the property middle class. There was a stark polarization between these classes. The middle class and the working class demanded different things from the state, which were not being provided. This can especially be seen in the National Workshops Revolution. Demands for reform led to a fear of disorder, wanting a strong nation, and a collapse, like of Napoleon III. The French Revolution of 1789 polarized Europe. The Congress of Vienna attempted to establish a conservative international system to prevent further revolutions and maintain a balance of power and order. But a combination of new political movements and social movements, combined with economic hardship and hunger, undermined this conservative order and challenged their ability to put down revolts. These social movements occurred first in Latin America and Balkans, in Western Europe and Great Britain, but the revolution started in France. And the issues were framed differently after Napoleon, around new struggles for national identity and political and social reform, equal rights and all that. So the broad revolutionary alliances that had pushed for change in 1789 were broken apart by class politics, and earlier forms of utopian socialism gave way to Marxism. Romanticism lost its appeal as realism bit harder. Conservatism, liberalism, and socialism adapted to new political conditions. And these conditions were very challenging for the Congress of Vienna, and they were just not able to turn back the hands of time, because people kept pushing for change, And after the French Revolution of 1788, things were just moving head speed forward, no exceptions. Leaders were given up, and it could just never be the same again. Pretty much. I hope that helped.